This is the first in a new series here at the center aimed at the rising generation of foreign policy, national security leaders. And so thanks for joining us for that inaugural event. Many debates about what America should do about crises in Syria, Ukraine, about what America should do about Iran's nuclear program, about what we should do about an intransigent Pakistan, in Afghanistan post-2014. Really, what these conversations, while these conversations sometimes focus on ways, usually focus on ways, means, and if we're lucky, ends, what they're really about is what shape American leadership should take around the world as we proceed further into the 21st century, and that's what we're here to talk about today. We have three very interesting speakers with three diverse perspectives, and I'll introduce them in the order they'll be speaking. Joshua Walker is at the German Marshall Fund as a non-resident transatlantic fellow. He's also the director of global programs at APCO Worldwide in the Office of the CEO, specializing in foreign policy, international affairs, and public-private partnerships. Before moving to the private sector, Dr. Walker was a CFR International Affairs Fellow, where in that capacity he served as a senior advisor to a variety of executive branch principals, working at the U.S. Department of State, in Secretary Kerry's office of the chief economist, and serving in Secretary Clinton's Global Partnership Initiative as a senior advisor on the Middle East and North Africa. We have Elbridge Colby here on my right. He's the Robert M. Gates Fellow at the Center for New American Security, where he focuses on strategic deterrence, nuclear weapons, conventional force, intelligence, and related issues. In 2012, he served as the deputy head for national security personnel in the Mitt Romney pre-transition effort, and also worked on several of the campaign's security policy teams. And he's also was most recently at the Center for Naval Analyses. And on my left, we have John Bew. John is the Kissinger Chair at the Library of Congress, where he's writing a book on the history of Anglo-American realpolitik. He's also a reader in history and foreign policy at the War Studies Department at King's College London. And he's the director of the International Center for the Study of Radicalization and Political Violence. His last book was called Castlereagh: A Life. It's very good. Very long, but very good. And so I'll just kick it over to Josh.
Can I ask one question? How do you actually pronounce the name Castlereagh? Castlereagh, okay.
It's the first American to get it right.
Okay.
Great. Looking around the room, it doesn't seem like I need to go into the normal spiel and kind of talk about the need for a next generation and thinking about foreign policy in this town. I see a lot of good friends around the table and a lot of great thinking. What I was asked to do is kind of lay the kind of set the scene and let my far more accomplished and smarter colleagues take it from there. But I've just landed from Qatar, and I think that's a really interesting segue into what we're talking about in terms of American international leadership. Because I think there's always a disconnect between the way that we Americans in D.C. in particular see foreign policy and the way it's perceived overseas. And I think somewhere in between might lay the truth in terms of where American leadership is right now in the world. Obviously, with what's going on in Ukraine, what was going on before that in Syria, American leadership is probably needed more now than ever before, and yet at the same time, there are more questions than any of us have seen before. Thankfully, I'm no longer in the government, so I don't have to start out by saying nothing I say it should be reflected of the U.S. government, but I'll say that on behalf of my organizations as well, because I have a tendency to speak more freely in these types of forums, and I want to have an honest debate with you and a discussion with you. But what I was most struck by being in Qatar was thinking the fact that with what's going on in that country in terms of the major regional issues, this is the first time we've seen the Gulf states, including Saudi Arabia and UAE, pull their ambassadors out of Qatar. And Qatar, in many ways, is very dependent on these countries and is very dependent on the U.S. as the largest Air Force base in the region is right there in Qatar. On my flight back, I sat with nothing but American Air Force men. And when I had the conversations on the ground with the Qatari energy ministers or other officials on the ground, it was almost as if what was happening in the world was not related to them at all. In some ways, they were annoyed at the distraction that they saw, and that was the term that was used, what was coming from Eastern Europe and Russian aggression. And they basically said, look, if you guys make this into a Cold War all over again, that's on you. But the real kind of coming change is in East Asia, which is fascinating to think about, because I think there's a feeling, those of us that work on the Middle East, that every time you go to the region, it's always about the region. And as we saw when the president went to Saudi Arabia, I'm sure that their discussions centered on some of the issues around Qatar as kind of the largest gas producer in the world. The fact that we don't think about these types of issues as much in a broader context, and in D.C. we often are very segmented, right? Whether it's in the government, where the State Department has its own Near Eastern Affairs Bureau and others have their own way of doing it, the countries that I tend to focus on, including Turkey, are always split between these regions. And so it's particularly difficult to come up with one answer to what is America's position on X or Y. Because even within an administration, the position of someone at the State Department versus someone at the Defense Department, as opposed to somebody in the White House, are all kind of discombobulated. And it's very, very difficult to explain that to anyone overseas. And I'm constantly amazed when I travel overseas that everyone assumes that a lack of policy, or sometimes, not coordinated policy, must be a nefarious conspiracy of some sort. So clearly, with what's going on in Turkey right now and all the protests that we're seeing and all the other major problems, America, or maybe Israel at some point in time, is behind every aspect of this. And while in D.C. and as Americans, we dismiss this, if that's what's pervading the media landscape, if that's what's shaping the perceptions of people in the region, we as kind of future policymakers have to think about what that means in terms of the constraints that we have. I like to think a lot about kind of Turkey in some ways. Obviously, that's the area I know best and speak the language and have been going back and forth, having lived there, worked at the embassy, been in the bureau, working on the Turkey desk, and kind of focused as a director on issues that went from kind of Morocco to Indonesia, Turkey being right in between as this kind of cliched land bridge. But when you look at what's happening in Turkey, you have a country that is kind of a stalwart Western ally that's part of NATO, that has gone through a major transformation in the last decade that has been mostly positive for the U.S. interest. It's been mostly positive in the sense that as Turkey has become more democratic, as the military rule in Turkey has transitioned to a civilian one, albeit a more strong, centralized rule, as we've seen with Prime Minister Erdogan and kind of his heavy-handed tactics, it's been interesting to watch the kind of discomfort there is in Washington. It's almost as if people would prefer to keep Turkey in a very small box. It's a lot easier to deal with Turkey when it's simply a European ally or a Middle Eastern ally. It's almost difficult for American policymakers to kind of eat and kind of walk and chew gum at the same time. And yet Turkey, which has been around in the international system for at least 600 years as the Ottoman Empire that was both a European and a Middle Eastern, has always kind of had the juxtapositions, the paradoxes within. And in many ways, that is the strength of our alliance with Turkey, and should be the place that we as U.S. foreign policymakers should be having that discussion. But instead, we have interagency fights about how we want to use this. So the Defense Department says we want to focus mostly on Turkey because of Syria, and we want to focus mostly on Turkey because of the instability that we see and the threat we see from terrorism around the world and what Al-Qaeda is beginning to do in Turkey, etc. And you have the State Department that says, no, we need Turkey when it comes to the Arab-Israeli peace process, we need Turkey when it comes to Iran, we need Turkey for a lot of our other priorities. And then you have other areas, whether it's intelligence or treasury or commerce, who have all their own areas. And one of the most difficult things to explain to a Turkish audience, particularly Turkish leadership, is, and full disclosure, the Turkish foreign minister was my advisor when I was in Turkey. So I have these conversations every time I go there. He's always like, Joshua, why is it you don't give us the respect we deserve? And I think every one of our 192 strategic allies has that same conversation with us, right? We don't get the respect that we deserve. Why aren't you paying attention? Sure, there's 192 countries in the world, but we're a G20 member. We're more important. We're at least in the top 5 or top 10. And if you read the press reports, it seems that President Obama has a deep and personal relationship with Prime Minister Erdogan. At least he talks to him on the phone as one of the top 5 world leaders after, Cameron, Merkel, a few others. And what's interesting about that discussion is, if you think about what countries get their own point of contact throughout the interagency, they tend to be problem countries. They're reactive countries, right? So we have a SAR when it comes to Iran. We have a SAR when it comes to North Korea. You can call them special envoys, but I think SAR is a good way to describe these individuals, the way they do things. But when it comes to a country like Turkey, they kind of let it fall into the chain of command. And what ends up happening is the Assistant Secretary of Europe and the Assistant Secretary of the Near East have to have conversations. Okay, on the Syria thing, you guys are in charge of it. When it comes to NATO and EU enlargement, you guys deal with it. And it really creates these major kind of fissures in between the two. And it strikes me that it's not just about Turkey. This is about a much larger region. In fact, I would argue that of all the areas around the world that we look at we have a lot of expertise in this area, but we never bring it together. The Turkic world stretches all the way from the Adriatic to the Great Wall, and when you think about the major problems that there are in Xinjiang in China, for example, or you think about the Central Asian republics and the possibility of there being some type of revolution or color revolution, as we've seen in other areas throughout this region, it seems to me that this is an area from an energy politics and kind of a great game philosophy perspective that as Americans we should be very actively involved in, because in some ways we're not directly involved in that fight in the sense that we're not physically connected because we have the kind of the blessing of the Atlantic and the Pacific on either side. But it strikes me that if America wants to have a larger leadership role, it's not just about doubling down on our transatlantic relationship, which is important, but it seems obvious for our generation at least that going from the transatlantic to the trans-Pacific leadership role, that one of the key factors is how are we going to deal with our kind of Eurasian allies? And these are not allies in the same sense that we have in Europe. These are individuals, countries that don't share a lot of our values. And so the kind of the rhetoric that we use constantly, it's not just this administration, I would blame a lot of American leaders. We tend to be very idealistic in the way we talk about things. And so we set very high policy rhetoric priorities and we're never able to deliver. One of the frustrating things constantly when I was in the State Department was I was the director of this thing called Partners for New Beginning, which came out of President Obama's speech in Cairo. And anybody who's traveled to the region knows just the euphoria that followed both President Obama's election and the speech he gave. Because, like it or not, that speech was seen as the first time that an American president had acknowledged the struggles and the victimization of Muslims around the world. And there was a feeling that there was actually going to be a change and that America was going to partner with our Muslim allies. And, of course, here, I use a small m Muslim, not big M, because the differences between Sunni and Shia, Alevite, etc., we're seeing clearly develop. And it's much harder to explain to somebody in Kansas or in Kentucky, not to pick on those Ks, but to talk to them about these differences in some ways. And when you have people in this region of the world who say, look, President Obama promised me this. What was interesting is you can't blame the president for giving a major speech of this sort, but you can blame different agencies that created structures that then gave hope that I would say is false hope. And I think it's almost worse sometimes to utter the words and to make promises that then you don't keep. And what's even worse is, it's one thing if you were going to keep those promises and we looked at our resources and said, okay, now we're going to focus and we're going to have a priority here. But sometimes the kind of the short-term benefit of kind of saying the right thing to somebody actually has a long-term consequence. And I would argue that when it comes to this particular region of the world in the Middle East, it's very difficult to find that right balance. And different administrations have gone in different swings from one end to the other. And I think what we're seeing right now is kind of a readjustment of that, but at the very worst time we could possibly have, because we've set some red lines in Syria that the international community has looked at and said, look, you just haven't lived up to that. With what's going on in Egypt, we don't have as much strategic kind of resources as we would like, and yet at the same time we underestimate our own power sometimes. And this goes back to my very first point about perceptions. And so I would think one of the most important areas that we as kind of the next generation can focus on is understanding how those outside the world look at us. I spent most of my life living overseas. And so when I hear the conspiracy theories, when I look at this stuff, rather than simply saying that's ridiculous, they don't know who we are, I try to understand the root of where it comes from. And I think particularly in the Middle East, I think even when you look towards other areas of the world, whether it's Latin America or Eurasia, there is a feeling of kind of having never been on the center of international politics. It's very unique and different than, say, the Europeans or Asians, which sometimes, as the Middle Kingdom, in some ways, the last 100 years has been a small blip and they're coming back into their normal place. If I'm sitting in the so-called periphery of world politics, there is a real feeling that, people owe us something, and they look at America as the great equalizer and the great balancer. And the discussions that we're having in this country with our elections coming up in 2014 confound people around the world. They just don't understand kind of the isolationist thinking, because they say, look, don't you know your own history? Look what happened last time America exited the international environment. And you say, look, that's fine, but if I'm trying to explain to my grandmother who watches, Fox News and is explaining, why is it Obamacare is going to kill her, that's not the same priority as Qatar's kind of major LNG facility that they're trying to get through the Department of Energy and needs just a little bit of a push. That's just not on the same scale for them. And the discussions that are happening, there's a disconnect between the kind of proactive foreign policy that needs to happen, that is a good investment in our future, and may take having people who know the region and having experts to work on it versus political operatives. And I think the tyranny of the inbox, the reactive nature that we see in government is true in all of our lives everywhere we are. But I think that the difficulty of being able to kind of multitask in this environment, and also, you know, to end on a more optimistic note, I think many of us kind of look towards the future, and we have kind of this hope that there is something there, but we don't kind of believe those that have come before us that have set the bar so high, and we look at kind of the naive optimists and say, look, let's be a little bit more realistic, and at the same time we can hope for the best but prepare for the worst. And I would say that we have more tools now, whether it's social media or whether it's kind of public-private partnerships in our private sector, that are becoming much smarter about these things. And the question really is, how do we take a lot of the government bureaucracies that work in this town and kind of synergizing the two? So let me just kind of stop there. I've thrown out a lot of different things. We can have a lot of different conversations from there, but I'll wrap it up there. Thank you.
Great. Well, thanks, Josh, and thanks very much to Ryan and to Paul and to the whole CFTNI staff for having me. Very delighted to be here. So Ryan asked me to sort of address the issue of sort of U.S. kind of global strategy, narrow question. But I'll, you know, and sort of offer some thoughts on, you know, where we should go from here. And I know everybody has their own view on the subject, but I thought I'd offer some sort of very general points that maybe will spur some discussion, maybe some opposition. But you know, with that, I mean, it seems to me, and I think it's a fairly unremarkable point, that we're at something of an inflection point in global politics. Obviously, there's, you know, rapidly and substantially shifting global power balances driven by this sort of secular shift towards economic prosperity and growth in the Pacific region, the sort of the aging and the sort of, if you will, kind of saturation of the European economy. Saturation is not the right word, but the slowing of the European economies. And so the kind of the geopolitical and geoeconomic basis that the world had you know, experienced or knew since the Second World War is finally coming to an end. In some ways, it was predicted in the 1970s, but now it's actually coming to pass. And part of this is, you know, a sort of an objective structural shift. There's also cultural awakening in non-European parts of the world that you know, are making the world generally, you know, genuinely a sort of a more globalized environment. But there are also, from our perspective, fundamental constraints on U.S. efforts that we did not necessarily face either during the Cold War or during the period of unipolarity, in particular, following the collapse of the Soviet Union. And so, you know, there's a sense that the kind of the old ways, you know, I think there's a perception, even though it hasn't necessarily been accepted at the political level, at least rhetorically, there's a perception that the kind of the old ways of doing business don't work. And so I think we're at a point where we're asking, you know, what is it that we really want to do? What is it that we really want to achieve? What is our purpose in international affairs? And you know, there's several schools. It's disturbing to me to see thus far how the sort of strategic debate on these questions has gone. I mean, I look at it kind of, you know, with special focus on the sort of right side of the spectrum, but I think if you look more broadly as well in sort of politically relevant and salient debates, because there seems to me right now to be something of a, you know, what I think is a false choice between a sort of reflexive hostility to any change from the way we approached international politics in the 1990s on the one hand, and a kind of an antediluvian isolationism that I just don't think is actually a genuine policy choice or really serves our interests or is particularly practical on the other. And I think you see that in particular on the right side of the spectrum. I mean, on the one side you have you know, a sort of an almost a kind of an emotional attachment to this, you know, exceedingly assertive U.S. kind of hegemonic pretension that typified the unilateral moment, and that characterized both Democratic and Republican administrations after 1991, but that were basically a product of the structural reality of the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the absence of any countervailing power, you know, in the sort of 15 years or so, 20 years after the collapse of the USSR. And obviously that was, in most respects, a great thing, but it led to certain habits of doing business that were particularly fitted to that environment. For instance, in the military realm, there was a real absence of serious military challenges to the U.S. projection of power in any place that we would particularly care to operate. And this led, for instance, in the U.S. military to a way of doing business, the shock and awe, the turning off the lights approach that is not necessarily adapted to to today's environment or to the environment that preceded. On the other hand, you have a sort of the U.S. should come home. The U.S. should abandon its sort of, alliance commitments, its existing relationships. That is sort of a throwback to the Taft era, the Robert Taft era, and before. And I think this is, to me, you could see it's sort of Rand Paul and Dick Cheney. Both obviously have moved around on the issue areas over time. But I think if you think about it in a very kind of simplistic way, those maybe represent the kind of the classic poles there. But to me, the not to be sort of banal, but the truth lies somewhere in between, and it's just been sort of disturbing to me, frustrating to me, not to see more of a kind of a strong sort of politically relevant voices in this respect. Basically, one that recognizes on the one hand that we don't live in an environment in which we can use military force and the assertion of our political and economic power without consideration of the consequences, without considerations of the limits to our power and the consequences of our behavior, which I think is the downside of what you might see as sort of strong and neoconservative point of view. But on the other hand, that recognizes that an isolationist approach is very risky and really doesn't serve our interests. And so my kind of perspective, the way I look at it, which bizarrely to me seems to be relatively unusual, and not because it's an unknown intellectual point of view, it's a pretty well-established one, but maybe because it's not particularly well adapted to the environment that we've been living in, but it's sort of the kind of liberal empire, and that's sort of a fraught term, but I think it's a useful one, the liberal empire approach, which comes out of thinking about people like Robert Gilpin and Bill Odom in his book America's Inadvertent Empire, which is basically a sense that, look, the international system is by its nature, somewhat, anarchic is maybe a little strong, but, it has chaotic tendencies, anarchic tendencies. It has inherent structural direction towards tension and potentially conflict, towards distrust. So actually the creation of structures and the creation of lasting and positive stability is actually a triumph. And the United States has been able to do that. And that U.S. leadership, this is something where I've changed my views over the last sort of probably 10 years or so, is more of an appreciation of the importance of leadership in particular, that some of the problems of coordination, of bringing bringing groups together or entities together in a situation in which trust can't be assured and compliance can't be sort of you can't have absolute confidence in compliance, and where a major first mover that is willing to expend energy to make sure that this kind of coordinated activity happens is actually really valuable. In some of the economics literature, Manker Olson and some of these things, these have changed my thinking. So I've come to have a greater, I think, appreciation in the last years of the importance of American leadership. I think sometimes there's sort of these peons to American leadership that don't take into account the costs and the downside, and there are significant costs towards leadership. You need to just look at Vietnam or the wars that we've been fighting in the last 10 years to appreciate that. But I think that shouldn't take away from the sense that the United States, both through formal institutions like NATO, like the WTO, et cetera, we've been able to build a system that has positive reinforcement, that has a kind of win-win kind of characteristic, and that shouldn't be assumed to be self-generating, right? I think the downside, the real flaw of the sort of isolationist point of view, if you will, is that there's an assumption that stability, that a positive stability, a positive security, that positive economic interactions are sort of self-generating. And I think that is not borne out by history. And if, you can't prove it because you can't prove a negative, but I look at the system from, a small c kind of conservative point of view, and I say, well, we have a system since 1945 that we know works pretty well. It's a lot better than what went before. And so let's not mess with success, but let's also adapt to the reality that we face a different geopolitical situation. And that, brings up the question of, sure, Bridge, thanks for your sort of encomium to the sort of the liberal empire, but can we pull it off? Is it too expensive on the one hand? Are we capable of doing it economically? And also, does the geopolitical structure allow it? In China in particular, you have the rise of a power that, by most assessment, is within a couple of decades going to be a larger power than we are, and that has, I think, a different approach towards the international system than we do, not without reason. And so I think this to me is actually the most interesting and important question. Not whether we would want to perpetuate the system as it exists today, which is, I think, basically pretty good for us and for most others involved, but can we pull it off? And I think that where we are right now in history, the answer to that question is yes. We think so, and we should act as if it is the case. I think there's obviously, without being boosterish, I think that we have tremendous internal resources in this country. Obviously, there's economic vitality, and I think most people are confident that in the longer term we will resume a more favorable rate of growth. We have enormous cultural resources in terms of our pull capability, in terms of our, if you will, soft power. I hate that term, but our soft power influence that continues to be very valuable in our relations and our leadership capability. And fundamentally, despite some of our bad mistakes over the years, foolish mistakes, I think we are basically non-threatening. We are a sort of an insular power that's set away from most of the other countries of the world, and that basically we're pretty content with the country that we have territorially and in other respects. There's Reagan's famous line about the Soviet Union when he finally realized that they were actually afraid of us. He said, "Well, what the hell do they have that we would want?" I mean, that's the sort of, I think that bespeaks a very fundamental American way of looking at things. But that's also true that we are not actually an imperialist power, and so we are, as objectionable as we may be, we're a lot less objectionable to, say, countries in East Asia than Chinese hegemony might be, or in Eastern Europe than Russian hegemony might be, or in the Middle East than Iranian hegemony might be. So that's an advantage for us. But I think, this shouldn't be a cause for sort of sanguinity or lethargy or kind of just a continued way of doing business, but rather I think we need to focus a lot more, and this is where I differ, for instance, from both the strong neoconservatives and the isolationists, but particularly some of my also conservative internationalist colleagues who I agree with sometimes, but maybe the more neoconservative group, that I think we need a lot more focus and a much clearer, sort of more realistic-eyed approach towards our military engagements, towards our strategic commitments, towards the aspirations that we are seeking to achieve in the international environment. For instance, I think this country is all about human dignity and about a kind of liberal order, but I think we can get by without every country in the world agreeing with us politically. I don't subscribe to the French revolutionary point of view about that every country that we want to do business with should agree with us politically. I think we can do business with others. Now, if we have the opportunity, say in the 1990s, where we can put pressure on Indonesia or something, rather than allowing it to be, rather than sort of dealing with a Suharto at his most fearsome, then we can put pressure on it. But we also need to understand that there's a competitive international environment, and that the sort of human rights and democracy objectives should be kind of appropriately valued, and I think they should be put below sort of strategic and geoeconomic considerations as a general principle. And so, in particular, I think the thing that we really need to focus on is the rise of China, which will, in Napoleon's words, the rise of China will shake the world, and that's what's happening. And China, we need to make sure that China's rise happens in a way that's relatively stable, that's conducive to the perpetuation of the existing order. And the only way to do that, I think, is the good fences make good neighbors. We need to have the appropriate military capability to deal with China, which will allow us to deal with the sort of lesser included cases on the whole, the ones that we really, really need to be able to deal with. We need to have the kind of trade and economic policy to go along with that, things like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which in the long term I think should benefit us anyway. And so it's that sort of focus that we're saying we really want to perpetuate the existing system. We don't need to achieve everything that we might like to achieve, or some of us in Washington or in the United States might like to achieve, but there are things that we do need to do. Balancing China's rise, or containing Iranian aggression or coercion, or limiting the effects of Russian revanchism or adventurism. These are the kinds of things, and other things, will sort of satisfice or mitigate. And so to me, I'm hoping that, and I'm short-term pessimistic, long-term optimistic that this point of view will prevail, because I think it's sort of it's sort of unremarkable, which should ultimately hopefully lead to its adoption. But I think it makes sense, and force of circumstance will press us in this direction. That we simply can't approach international problems in the way that Bill Clinton did in 1999. That we can't approach problems the way that George Bush did in 2003. But on the other hand, I think there will be. I'm confident that the American people understand the benefits and the importance of maintaining our international role, and so won't go down this sort of the isolationist road either. But I'm not so much of a Marxist that I think it's inevitable, and that's why I think people like me have maybe some utility in this whole sort of situation, because I think it's important that people kind of actually start making these arguments and demonstrating the utility, because apparently they're not self-evident. So thank you.
Well, first of all, thank you to Ryan for the invitation, and thank you to my colleagues in the panel for setting me up nicely. And I won't go on too long, because I know there's nothing more than that Americans like than British people telling them what to do and explaining to them what leadership really means. So I will speak as a historian. I will also speak as a Brit with mind to certain historical commonalities that I think are relevant, but also I think finally, most importantly, I will speak as someone who lives in and works in a country which is a very important ally of yours. So I will, if you like, do the alliance perspective back up and shine it back on you, and that's from with the risk of sounding like an intern. That's from being 6 months in DC, and I'll offer you my perspective on that. As I say, as a Brit, there are certain similarities here with Britain in the 19th century, which was the global superpower, without giving you a history lesson. First of all, 2 Protestant nations in origin, 2 Enlightenment nations, and I think that irreducible ideological core is very striking when you consider these things from a historical perspective. So no matter how much we talk about the national interest, no matter how much we talk about self-interest, if you take the long sweep of history, those are irreducible aspects as to the way we view the world, and I think that's very important. And one thing I've discovered or has been reinforced here is just how subjective this idea of a national interest is, and I think that's a very important theme. Britain also in the 19th century had, like the United States does now, essentially a self-interest in a relatively peaceful world. That is a peaceful world with freedom of trade, freedom of movement. Obviously, its assets were scattered around the globe. And basically stability outside its immediate geostrategic neighborhood, and therefore also an interest in rules, particularly, and I think this is something that we forget, particularly in the Anglo-American world, that those rules, those international rules, are crafted out of our victories, and they're crafted in our image. So therefore, we've already heard about China's different perspective of the international community, a lot of other revanchist, revisionist powers. We, Britain in the 19th century, America in the 21st century, are essentially status quo powers, and I think that is an important thing to consider. Not into territory grabbing, and that's sometimes the sort of misbegotten understanding of the British Empire. It was never really about that, or necessarily imposing one's will. I mean, that's not our kind of inclination, although, again, this is how we come across in the world. And again, Britain in the 19th century, America in the 21st century, a perception of being hypocritical about the way we perceive, about the way we are perceived. Despite there being a certain justification in our view that what's good for us, freedom of movement, stability, democratic governance, is also what's good for the world. I think that's a justifiable view, but bear in mind the charge of hypocrisy. And by the way, the smartest British strategic thinkers of the late 19th and early 20th century essentially took that hypocrisy on board and regarded it as an asset at a certain level. And I think we can be worried about consistency a little bit too much in that respect. As an outsider or someone from an ally in DC, a few things that occurred to me, and I want to pick up on what Josh said about a kind of a disconnect between various arms and instruments in the way we conduct and construct policy, and also Elbridge's point about the sort of poor strategic debate, the fact that we're still at the level of kind of mudslinging and categorization. And that's something that really has struck me in DC, I've got to say, is how deep the trenches are dug in terms of ideological terms. I have been called a realist, a neoconservative, a social democrat, a liberal internationalist, and I probably am all of the above. And I've only been here for 6 months. So, these categories, and I think that's partly due to the fact that the debates over foreign policy have been so bitter since the end of the Cold War, and the fact that every discussion is, well, first instinct, where did he or she stand on Iraq? Where did he or she stand on Afghanistan? Are they a good egg? Are they on my side? And perhaps the one sort of advantage of Crimea is to kind of shake us out of that kind of self-absorbed stupor where we're just having our own debates with ourselves and our kind of introspective sort of worldview, that reminds us that there are other people with different views in the world, and actually what matters is not always what happens intellectually in DC or what side or camp you're on. I think that's an important perspective. And again, above all, this sort of idealist-realist divide, and this comes from 6 months of essentially sitting in the Library of Congress and reading these debates throughout the course of the 20th century. We've always used these terms. They essentially mean nothing when you break it down to anything. I'll give you one example. Walter Lippmann, someone who starts the 20th century arguing that America needs to engage in the world in a front-footed fashion, ends after the Second World War, urges American restraint. And if you like, Lippmann encapsulates, and many others do that, Lippmann encapsulates essentially what to me is the real debate here, and it's a difference of emphasis, an argument that we should exercise restraint in the way we behave around the world as the global superpower. I say we, I sound like an American now, but a sort of a highly moral discourse that restraint is the key thing, and we make errors when we jump into things, and an inclination towards a more front-footed response, a kind of Churchillian idea where you deal with threats in the periphery swiftly and quickly. You project power, not necessarily leading to war, and hopefully not leading to war. And I think in a way, again, this Crimea situation has kind of awoken that actually inclination, and that is a debate that can be had tactically. You can have an inclination on one side or the other, but we need not jump sort of categorize ourselves in sort of severely divided camps. I think that is important. Again, Crimea, it doesn't really matter if you break it down to national interests. I mean, that's the bottom line with Crimea. It doesn't really matter to America. However, the question is therefore, well, where's the next step? Does Eastern Ukraine matter? Does Europe really matter? And you can always say no. I mean, America, like Britain in the 19th century, has a certain luxury that the wars we fight and the choices of projection of power are wars of choice because of this sort of relatively insular security. However, you know, the story tells us in the 20th century that is not the sort of prevailing American perception of where its interests lie. So Crimea matters, again, because it's a new pattern of international behavior. It's helped us wake up from these things. We recognize in Crimea a pattern that may occur in the Chinese neighborhood and other portions and parts of the world. Again, nothing sort of explicit here, nothing that's a tipping point, but I think to be able to think in terms of new patterns is a very useful thing to do strategically. On this sort of future prediction, the futurology, again, you see that in DC a lot. I mean, I'm a historian, so again, for me, historicism over science, and again, I can agree with an Irving Kristol or a Henry Kissinger who would both argue precisely that. I think that historical grounding on things, an emphasis on managerialism and patience is actually the key here. Future prediction, this is kind of in the 1990s thing, even into this current period, reflected in military spending, conversations about strategy. Every time we think we've got the future, whether it be drone warfare, whether it be high-tech warfare, something changes in the world. Why does that happen? Is it because we're bad at predicting the future? No, it's because the enemies or the rivals around the world are grafting ourselves around our image and responding to our strengths and weaknesses. So I think be careful on this. You know, the current thing now is that counterinsurgency is dead, or that big, large standing armies aren't useful. Actually, you can see a scenario that large standing armies in a kind of peacekeeping capacity, if not a kind of a soothing counterinsurgency capacity, might be useful things around the world. So beware that sort of prediction of this is the way it's going to go. On the diplomatic language, and I think this is actually something that Josh pointed out, and I'm the advantage of going third. I can reflect on that. A closer matching of ends and means. The language of diplomacy has got a little bit cheaper, in my view. We are better at it. We are better at articulating our positions. We are better at sounding soothing and liberal around the world. We are better at sounding tough in some respects. But actually, in terms of matching ends and means, we're not so good at this anymore. And this kind of rot has happened. I think it's partly a reflection of American security, just like it was a reflection of security in the 19th century. It's kind of become a garb or a cloak for policy. And there's a lot of throwaway diplomatic lines, whether it be the Cairo speeches, the two Cairo speeches of 2006 or Obama's speech in 2009, or it's about sounding good domestically. If you think about all this sort of false hope is a phrase Josh used, but also red lines, this perspective, you know, why say Assad has to go when you have no intention of backing that up at a certain level of point? I mean, the reason is to sound that you have some sort of moral parameters. I think we basically be a lot more careful as to how we use that language, and actually I think less sort of megaphone diplomacy in this respect might be a kind of a useful way of proceeding in the next decade or so. As to great power politics, patience, managerialism. We're also into the sort of episodic and solutions-oriented approach to foreign affairs. Episodic in the sense that a candidate can be made or broken on a certain decision or issue. Okay, Hillary Clinton, Benghazi, as an example, kind of a swift boat syndrome when it comes to certain issues. Everybody's so concerned about one position and one stance that someone had, and I think that's again a nature of the way, sort of impatient nature of democratic politics. But I think it's got extra impatient the way these things are fought. So finally, as from a sort of British perspective. I was one of the people who thought that the parliamentary vote, where Britain essentially ruled itself out of even considering military action over Syria as an ally. By the way, we were pretty useless in terms of what we could actually have done. But that's not essentially the point. Britain had a parliamentary vote where we ruled out any action over Syria or even considering a further vote on action in Syria. Now, I was one of the people who regarded that as a pretty problematic thing for Britain. In the 21st century, essentially deserting its main ally, the country that provides it with a security umbrella. Counterintuitively, though, one thing that occurred to me thereafter is actually it reinforced the fact that America does need allies. The British parliamentary vote set in train a motion of events in which essentially the president said he did not want to go to Congress, did not want to go to war without the support of Congress, which again, there's no necessarily sort of legal precedent necessity to do this. It was a political necessity, but also a political necessity born out of the fact that the president, I think, felt alone on this issue. And so, ironically, therefore, having thought that the Syria vote essentially wiped Britain out of the equation, abandoned our key sort of global superpower patron, sponsor, protector, actually, funny enough, it reinforced the idea that America does need allies, whether they be of military use. I think your allies, you have to look at some of your allies because Britain included, we have not been particularly military helpful. And we have been better than everyone else, by the way, in a lot of respects in the last 2 wars. But also you need ideological sustenance and support, and these things do matter. So America, on that respect, alliances do matter, and that's obviously an extremely self-interested thing for a Brit to say, and I'm trying to pull ourselves back after the Syria vote. But I just end on that one from sort of outsider's perspective.
Great, that was great. I'd like to open it up for questions, and I told Josh White that I'd call on him first. So, do we have the microphones?
Great, thanks. That was very interesting. A couple quick questions. First for Josh.
Judge, could you introduce yourself?
Oh, sure. Sorry, I'm Josh White. I'm at the Stimson Center. I work on Asia policy. I'm always a little skeptical of arguments that focus on bureaucratic dysfunction because I tend to think we don't have a bureaucracy problem, we have a reality problem, and that our challenge in dealing with a country like Turkey, which you know 100 times more about than I do, is probably that we have divergent interests which are simply being expressed through bureaucratic structures within the same building or within different buildings. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more to where you think the leadership challenges we face in the countries that you focus on are actual conflicted interests and where they are bureaucratic dysfunction that's actually sort of could be resolved. For Ridge, I really appreciated your comments. And it strikes me as somebody who works on Asia policy that there is actually sort of a surprising, remarkable, effective consensus on what our leadership looks like in Asia. Not on every issue, you know, at the margins. You can look at Taiwan, you can look at Burma. There are some disagreements, but if you look in the main at how people across the spectrum talk about China today, how they talk about India, how they talk about the thrust of our policy engagement, not a lot of disagreement. I was wondering if you could address that, if you think that's going to be a consistent theme, or if it's sort of a historical anomaly of the moment that we're in right now.
Let's respond. I actually agree with you. I really like the way you just put that in terms of a reality problem. I would agree with you, except for the fact that at least, and this is where, you know, a country like Pakistan that you know 100 times better than I do, there might be differences here in terms of how this works. In the case of Turkey in particular, because there has been this fundamental shift of kind of where the U.S. sees Turkey in terms of where we think its value really is. And what I mean here is that up until about 2005, Turkey was so clearly in the European camp for America. You know, we put it in every area there, and we were actually annoyed that the Europeans weren't moving quicker. And I think if you watch what's happening in Ukraine and Turkey, there's a large argument from the U.S. side to say, look, we've been pushing and fighting the good fight, but the damn Europeans, they just don't understand the value. That if they don't bring these major powers into the fold of a Europe that is inclusive, that includes these different groups, as opposed to being the so-called Christian club or the fortress Europe, this is exactly what's going to happen. Players like Ukraine that were on that path but were more or less rejected before they even got started, or a country like Turkey that has been on the doorstep of Europe for at least 40 years, or you could even say 20 years of actual progress. We can get into debates about it. But the bottom line is Turkey's been waiting on the steps of the European Union, which from an American perspective doesn't make any sense because we think about it from an outside strategic point of view. Europeans look at us and say, how would you feel if Mexico was going to be the 51st state? That's the better analogy. That's what Joschka Fischer and others say. So I think that you're right in the sense that there is divergent interest. There are differing views on Turkey, but the bureaucracies have been reinforcing that very divergent problem to the point now where literally where you sit determines your policy, as opposed to all of us being able to sit around the room and say, look, I may come from the State Department and I may use fancy language and diplomacy and I don't have very many tools to use right now. You come from the Defense Department, you've got all the tools, but you can't say anything because there is a backlash against the military relationship with Turkey that is completely non-existent right now, meaning in Turkey there's no counterpart for the Department of Defense to work with. So there is a bureaucracy problem, at least on the case of Turkey. And what I would argue is it's gotten worse over time, and what you would hope, and I think what you were alluding to, is if something reaches the level of priority for the United States, then we do tend to fix it. If it reaches the president's desk and it becomes a problem, then we try to fix it. The problem is in a case like Turkey, where suddenly Syria reaches the very top of the agenda, and the answer is, well, let's use Turkey. There's a real problem because Turkey is so far out ahead rhetorically against Assad. We are actually doing the counterintuitive thing. We're having to hold the Turks back from crossing the red line. They're rearing to go. They're not going to do it unless we're there for them. They can't do it without us in some ways. And so I think that that's where the disconnect begins to happen. And that's where if we were creative and were able to think much more in terms of the reality problem you described, we would be in a different situation. I don't think it's unique to Turkey, but I think that what you're alluding to in terms of the kind of the divergence or paradoxes or different national interests, at a certain point, that's why we pay the big bucks to the leaders. And that's where the buck stops. And that's where I think that the president and the apparatus of the national security has to be able to coordinate these different interests. And in the best ideal sense of the word, it all works together so competing interests end up amalgamating into the national interest. But I think in a case like Turkey, there has been some disconnect. And because there's no one who owns that, at the end of the day, everybody sitting around that table with the president, if it's not directly on Turkey, if it's Turkey's tangential to these other issues on Iran or Syria, then we keep on kicking the can down the road. And what I worry is that eventually when we do have to deal with Turkey as a hot issue, as we're beginning to see it more and more of, it's 100 times worse. And what scares me is that, Turkey taking the precedent of Pakistan, heading down that path where now you're like, well, if we'd just done something 5-10 years ago, if we just focused more on the European side and anchoring Turkey in that alliance, we'd have a different story. So that's where I'm coming at for that point.
Well, no, it's an excellent point, Josh. I mean, it is striking to see the degree of consensus in Asia. I mean, one of the interesting sort of advantages of being more of a functional, having more of a functional focus is that I go to a conference in Europe one day and Middle East a couple of months later, and then in Asia, and so there are actually quite distinctive sort of rhetorical styles and intellectual kind of formats or styles, if you will. So it's interesting. I was actually talking to a guy who's doing that you put me in touch with, who's doing a PhD thesis, a dissertation on a constructivist approach to Russia, and I said, well, I'm not really constructivist, but then as I sort of talked about it, I was like, well, actually, maybe there is something to this. So just sort of how communities conceive of themselves and so forth, I think in Asia, sort of reality has a sort of potency of its own. I mean, dealing with China is such a sort of sobering reality in a way that maybe Asia represents the future in the sense of, where we're having to deal with the sort of structural material kind of, not just material, but the sort of structural realities a bit more. But even then, it's sort of surprising. I mean, for instance, China experts as a whole seem to have a relatively strong degree of consensus about where Chinese behavior has gone in a way that, you don't see, for instance, in the Russia. I mean, I've been here for some Russia discussions where it's just striking how different and how much sort of personal emotion there is involved in the Russia debate that there doesn't seem to be in the China debate. So it's actually I'm actually perplexed. I'm one of the reasons I do like working on Asia is that there is more of a, I don't know, it tends to be more. I don't know what the right word is. That's not sort of fraught, laden with meaning, but that people tend to address the problem, I think, in a more constructive and, in my mind, kind of appropriate way. But I don't have a good answer for you. But it's certainly something. Given that I think Asia is the most important region in the world for us, it's something that I suppose we should be grateful for.
Christina?
Hi, Christine Vargas. I manage marketing and communications for Avicent. Per communications, do you feel that the U.S. is effectively communicating its wants and needs to its allies and others? How can we improve in doing so? And what non-obvious offices in government are responsible and could possibly be effective in perhaps crafting and recrafting this message on a regular basis and communicating it consistently?
I'll jump in right away from a self-serving point of view since I work at a communications firm now. It would seem obvious that I would say it matters, but that's a little too trite. I think what we talked about, and I think you alluded to this as well, in this day and age in which everything we say can and will be communicated, whether we like it or not, and the media and the public diplomacy aspect of diplomacy is no longer in the hands of diplomats. I mean, I can tell you firsthand, being in the State Department, the disconnect between kind of people who understand how Twitter is used. And when you looked at the Arab Spring and the uprising and the way that one Foreign Service officer in Cairo could tweet something that would cause mass chaos on one hand, and people in Washington didn't even understand the mechanism that was being used. I mean, there's no policy in the State Department, as far as I'm aware of right now, in terms of getting a tweet cleared. Whereas everything else that we do, in terms of the cables, everything else, has to be meticulously taken over. And those 140 characters can have far more damaging impact. And so there's a loophole right there that exists. And so I'm not arguing that we should, the problem with communications is if you try to centralize it and try to make sure every tweet is cleared for every Foreign Service officer who has any type of hashtag or has any type of, at State Department, it destroys the median. And all of a sudden, the very people we are trying to communicate to begin to mock us, right? So when you look at some of the ways in which governments communicate, they have one official source. And I think Turkey's a great example of this, right? They banned Twitter and YouTube recently because of the fact that they're using social media as kind of the boogeyman of all society's ills, and being able to use that as a proxy in some ways of kind of, these guys are out to get us. There's actually a conspiracy. We told Twitter to take down these incendiary type of things, which from an outside point of view. But you ask about where there is good work being done. There's a lot of underappreciated work being done. There's a commission within the State Department that actually focuses on public diplomacy. I've been a part of these groups, and what's fascinating is anytime you have a commission or anytime you have these discussions that are mandated by Congress to be done at agencies, there are certain incentives and certain kind of status quo that agencies want to maintain, and they don't like being told what to do on these things. And so I think one of the keys is, and this is where I think you come in and I come in and all of us come in, bureaucracies tend to work a lot better when you come to them with something. And so if you're able to develop a public-private partnership where we're like, look, we're not trying to tell you what to do. We're just trying to take what you're already doing and make it more effective. And I think you see this on the grassroots level. I'm constantly amazed between the disconnect between Foggy Bottom here in the State Department in Washington versus in the field. When you go to an embassy, or particularly our consulates around the world, the effectiveness by which those kind of public diplomacy officers and those who do communications on the ground and giving them the tools they need to actually effectively communicate our message, and the way in which they are being directed from Washington, there's a huge disconnect. And there's some really good practices, and I haven't really seen any study there. So part of it is on us to kind of bring it to the level of attention. I don't think that many of our congressmen and many of our senators and others who are in charge of oversight look at this as being anything more than just kind of a nice, flashy way of doing it. And I agree a lot with what John said, which is, we use communication better than we ever have in terms of our language is much nicer. But if there's a disconnect between the means and the end, what communication is only as effective as you're able to do that. So sometimes we don't want to communicate directly what our end goal is, because that would actually be disastrous in some areas. So I think finding the balance between the two, and I'll stop there because I could go on for days on this one.
Just add a tiny footnote to that, which is I agree with everything. I mean, your State Department's really good. Like the British Foreign Office really fancies itself as the French Foreign Office and the British Foreign Office basically win these various awards for themselves as the best foreign office in the world. And the French won it back last year. We've won it this year. Okay, so your State Department's good and full of smart people and experts. And it's silly to over criticize it. I think it goes right to the top, and it's the political level. And I think it's to be able to have political leaderships. If we are entering a phase, which is just a given, where the world is a more complex, difficult place, and American authority, or at least optimism about the capacity to change that, has been curtailed. That's a given. That's where we're at now because of the last 10 years. Therefore, the political leaders have to be able to take some water on board. And if they're not willing to do anything in Syria, to say, you know what, this is why we're not willing to do anything in Syria. Not to construct some sort of red line, because the red line was not about the world. It was about the perception of a president or whoever given that line. It was a throwaway line because to basically diffuse media criticism, to diffuse domestic criticism. That's the problem. So I think at that higher level, if we're entering this sort of more Hobbesian world, then the language I think has to be a little bit more Hobbesian. And this is going back to the 1970s. This is a horrible, nasty debates, and they still echo throughout our foreign policy, but the capacity to be able to take that criticism on board. You know what? At this moment in time, it's not our interest to do that. I think that's a sort of sign of maturity and national power. And by the way, Britain in the 19th century made its biggest mistakes, and it was often when it could not do that. Why did Britain end up in Egypt? It was an anti-imperialist Prime Minister, William Gladstone, who put us there because he was trying to soothe, trying to not deal with this in a sort of power projection type of way. So it can lead you into problems when you're not willing to say what the world is like in that type of way.
David?
Hi, David Adesnik, visiting fellow at AEI. And I guess my question is, should you all generally be pretty happy about where the current administration is on its foreign policy? That in the tone of all three of the remarks has been sort of slightly in the negative, that we need to get our bureaucracy better in working and communicating. We need to have a sort of find more of the exact balance between sort of values and interests and chart a middle course. But those are sort of the staple criticisms that experts offer of every administration, none of which ever gets these things right. And I was wondering then if you would suggest that, given the relative level of consensus you described about Asia or certain other places, perhaps the Obama administration is getting these things more right than you would expect, and it should be getting pretty high marks. And one bit of advice for John, to a great way to sound even more American, if you'd like, is always quote Yogi Berra. I don't know if you've discovered our strange obsession with this sort of short player of a strange colonial sport we developed, sort of a rip-off of cricket that we call baseball. And he is just a treasure trove. So the one, if you ever talk about the future, you're obliged to use his quote, which says, "Prediction is extremely difficult, especially about the future." And he has a wealth of these aphorisms you could probably pick up on a wiki quote or other parts of Wikipedia. And you'll have Americans eating out of your hand. That and the accent is all you need.
Okay, well, I'll take David's red meat bait. So, I think our remarks differ to the extent they were of relevance to the current administration. I mean, my take on the current administration is that while it has not made any major disastrous decisions, it leaves a great deal to be desired in terms of what the American people would want from an effective sort of administration on foreign policy. I mean, I have very significant disagreements with the administration on domestic policy, but the president and the senior levels of the administration, I think it's almost charitable to say that they seem particularly oriented towards avoiding sort of disaster or political liabilities arising from foreign policy. It's instrumentality kind of raised to the nth degree, and a very sort of episodic, ad hoc approach to foreign policy. I think it's actually kind of funny because you get very intelligent people coming out of the administration defending an ad hoc approach to foreign policy, which is sort of surreal. I mean, I think what the American people want from a president and from his administration is I mean, this word is overused, but it's what we want, is a strategic approach to foreign policy, and I think that's decidedly lacking. I think the Asia policy, the pivot, rebalance, that deserves commendation. I think it needs to be more genuinely implemented, both on the military side, also on TPP. You know, the administration did not get trade promotion authority on that subject yet. Hopefully they will. I mean, that's a huge issue for us in the region. But, you know, more broadly, I would love to have a president like, well, President Nixon, at least on these issues, President Reagan, President Bush, Eisenhower, you know, President Truman, you know, one who has a real vision for what the international environment should look like, what we need to do and what we don't need to do. John, I think you're exactly right about the importance of making choices and being upfront about it when you can. I mean, you don't have to bite the political bullet to the full extent, but, you know, this administration, I think Secretary Gates's memoirs illustrates this pretty well, that it's being driven much more by sort of a domestic political calculus. So, you know, what I would love to see is a, you know, and I mean, the other thing is this administration sort of seems, I was in Germany recently, and I don't want to be uncharitable, but at least some aspects of German foreign policy seem to kind of combine like a sort of naivete with like a cynicism, which is this sort of bizarre thing. And I think the Obama administration would be sort of also prey to that criticism, that there's this sort of, you know, the Cairo speech and, you know, some elements of the reset, and, you know, the outreach to Iran, which sort of exhibit a real kind of, you know, naivete, even if, you know, defensible in certain respects maybe. But then at the same time is sort of very calculating and sort of almost craven at certain points when their chestnuts are in the fire, sort of. And, you know, I think, you know, I think, John, you explained the sort of the Lippmann and the kind of the morality of the realists. You know, there's a book called Righteous Realists, which I'd commend to
Rosenthal.
you. And, Rosenthal is an excellent book. Yeah. You know, that you know, and I think you're also, just to sort of drift a little bit, I mean, I think your point about the divide between realists and idealists being a false one is there's a lot of truth there. The other one that I get particularly frustrated by is the most salient debate or the most salient spectrum in terms of the political debate in the United States right now on foreign policy seems to be hawk-dove, which to me is by far not the most important. You know, like, I am a conservative in my view about the international order, but I don't understand why somebody should be a hawk or a dove all the time, right? It depends on the circumstances. Sometimes you should be an inveterate hawk, and sometimes you should be more dovish, depending on the circumstance, depending upon our interest in the engagement, depending upon the aspirations of your potential opponent, et cetera, et cetera.
Churchillian, that would be Churchillian.
Yeah, right. I mean, hopefully, yeah. Well, of course, thank you. But you know, yeah. I mean, that's the instrument by which we are seeking to achieve ends, and so I find it bizarre and annoying that seems to be the most salient divide. But anyway, to return to David's question, I would love to see, and I'd love to see a stronger voice on the conservative end of the spectrum, because I see what I'm saying is like inherently conservative. It's status quo and orientation. It's, you know, to quote James Baker on why the first Gulf War was a good thing. Well, you know, almost no Americans were killed. We spread the political liability. We made money on the subject. You know, looked great. You know, that's a kind of a conservative approach to foreign policy that I'd like to see. You know, more trumpeted. I wish there were more evidence of it. I think there's enormous political opportunity, you know, to the extent that foreign policy makes any difference politically at all. But to that extent, does seem to be a political space there, a vacuum there that could be filled by a you know, an articulate Republican. But it hasn't been filled yet.
Can I just state the obvious real quick here, and I'm not going to be the guy defending ad hoc policy, thankfully. The obvious point here is that I think most of us in this room, even if you are a big D Democrat or a big R Republican, feel very differently about partisan politics than those ahead of us. And so I think there is a feeling among many of us, particularly those of us in the foreign policy community, that at the end of the day, a lot of the partisan bickering or the fighting and kind of the mudslinging that goes on at any given moment in terms of this moment versus the others that John talked eloquently about, there is a different feeling here. And I think what's interesting is if you've served in government, it's very easy to sit on the outside and criticize. I mean, many people in this administration were criticizing very harshly what George W. Bush and his administration were doing. Now when they find themselves in the exact same situation, we don't like to talk about it, but it looks very similar in terms of, you know, I would argue that in many ways, a lot of the decisions that are being made right now are being made based on the same calculations. And even though there might be different instincts and there might be a much stronger feeling that we can't use physical force, and military might is not something that this administration wants to use and has made it very clear in all sorts of different ways. But I think that one of the difference, and I think what will be telling for this generation is, everybody talks about the third party in this country, and it seems to me that being in this town, it's impossible not to pick a team at some point in time, even though all of us try to resist it because you want to be idealistic and focus on the national interest and where we are on these things. But I do tend to, maybe as a naive optimist here, believe that our generation will do things differently, so we can sit and have civil debates where we don't just can't, say, I'm not going to sit in this room and have this conversation just because you're a Republican. You could never possibly understand this. And I think what you're seeing reflected in all of us is a much more centrist kind of view where we may have differences here and there. I differ a lot with this administration on its Syria policy. When it began, that was a very easy place in which to put down a very small amount of American resource to mobilize forces to get us out of the situation. You could have predicted then exactly the cost it would have been. So I'll stop there, but I just want to simply put that out there.
Yeah, can I respond just because, I mean, there's a lot in there I agree with certainly about civil discourse, but I don't consider myself a centrist as such. I mean, I think moderation is a virtue, in the sense of one should always approach problems moderately to the extent that, but to some extent, sometimes extremism in defense of liberty is not a vice, depending on the situation. But I think of myself as actually, a conservative. Obviously, I'm a liberal in the sense that I think most Americans are. But so I would like to see the Conservative Party, to me, be more conservative on foreign policy. I mean, I think it's not the kind of conservative that is probably going to hopefully alienate people in this room or anywhere else, in the sense that I don't think it's, I'm not coming at you with pitchforks or something, but I do think I'm not looking for a centrist solution as such. I actually think that and I don't mean to differ with you, but to be disputatious, but because I think it's actually an important point.
Probably not for me to comment on or provide a scorecard in the Obama administration, but I will anyway. There's a difference between a recognition that you can't shape the future in your image in every single way. And I think that is the big lesson of the last decade. And, all of us, to a certain extent, we are the 9/11 generation, right? We're not the 68 generation. I think that's our defining thing. And also, there has been a curtailment of ambitions and a recognition that the world does not go the way you want it to. However, there's a difference between that and being seen to be at the mercy of events. And I think what happened in Egypt is a prime example of that, where there was 2 or 3 policies in operation, where there was hedging at a certain moment in time, where a firm line would not have got you necessarily the outcome that you desired, but may have put you in a position which made your leverage or didn't diminish your leverage or your status or your influence thereafter. And I think that's a key thing. On Syria, I actually completely agree with Josh, and this is from a British perspective. The debate was about Iraq. It was about an intervention. That was not the real debate. If you think that it matters that there are al-Qaeda-related groups in the tribal regions of Pakistan or Afghanistan, and essentially drone strikes are probably a relatively cheap and effective way of dealing with it. What you have now in Syria, and see Aaron Zellin at the back of the room who knows a lot about this, is way worse as a problem with potential blowback. So rather than sort of thinking in terms of should we intervene, is this an abstract interventionist, non-interventionist argument, that for me was never the argument. And again, we failed to adopt a managerial approach to that question. It was the same old neurotic debate. That's why I think actually the Crimea thing is actually useful, if only because it flushes out the last 10 years' debates to a certain extent, and it's a recognition it's not all about what we do, whether we talk nicely or whether we make mistakes. It's about what the world does as well, and I think that's a key thing. That's a sort of can sound patronizing, but I think it's just useful, and also perhaps useful to our generation for that. It's also not a return to some sort of Cold War world as well. I think we should resist that aspect of it. Finally, in terms of American strategy, and I'm reluctant to go down this sort of you should have a grand strategy approach. I'm pretty much inclined to Elbridge's point on that. I think a strategic approach matters. From the perspective of an ally, I'll tell you why it matters. Britain's strategy is essentially predicated, is the unspoken thing, around what America is going to do in the world. That's the bottom line reality, whether it be diplomatically or even in terms of military spending. If you look at our strategic defense review, that's the essence of our policy. We are your closest ally in the sense that we get this place, I think, a little bit more than any other nation. We're not your closest or most useful ally necessarily because we're not that militarily strong, and there might be others in the world. We're also not that economically useful. We'll be costing you a lot of money since the Second World War. However, we're about as good as allies as you can expect in this world. Our approach on Libya, for example, was to recognize the Obama administration wants to lead from behind. That's useful. You've got all the weapons, by the way. Our missiles don't even work. So we could run ahead with this issue. With the French and the Brits, by the way, big lesson the last 10 years, the resilience of interventionism with the French and the Brits. We are not giving up on interventionism. You forget Mali, you forget the push on Libya and the push on Syria again. We want to push forward with interventionism because we recognize that this sort of non-interventionist line is also a fantasy. Germans are a place apart on this. They have a different perspective, and they always have had a different perspective on that. But when we expected you to lead from behind, we tried to run out in front. And again, that's part of the Syria story here. Britain and France tried to run out ahead on this. Now, what happened is the British Parliament, for a series of problematic reasons, sort of kiboshed that. But an ally needs, a useful ally needs to know, broadly speaking, where its big friend is going to go. So it does matter that you have a strategy and a sort of consistency of approach. If those alliances, and you decide, and it's not for me to decide, those alliances are of use to you. Your allies like to craft themselves around you, and I think we've heard that with Josh, even with what's happening in Turkey as well. By the way, the Brits did want Turks in the EU as well. We're better aligned on that because you wanted us to say that.
All right, I think we have time for one more question. I know you'll have jobs to get to. Nick.
Thank you. Nicholas Myers. I'm the fellow for Russian military affairs at the Potomac Foundation. So it sounds like there's a large degree of interest in a larger grand strategic thought among people. And the biggest problem I run into dealing with especially Russian affairs, but it seems that it crosses everything, is that in this town people either become technical specialists or they learn about strategy. And obviously if everybody learns about strategy, you'll have total chaos in the top of government because who knows what's going on. And the American architecture of government is designed in the late 40s when strategy was pretty much going to be set by a couple of guys who recognized what the major threats to the United States are at any given moment. So what do you think should be done to better inculcate strategic knowledge in the technicalists who actually manage things? Because at least since the mid-19th century, America has been overly dependent on the one guy in the State Department who knows how to write treaties, the one guy who knows how the military is actually deployed around the world. And it seems that as these experts grow in prestige around the corners because they're the last ones who aren't politically sabotaged in public, there's just this giant divide between what is the capability of the United States and what are its strategic interests. And I think that is the story of what needs to be resolved in this generation.
Any takers?
It's a brilliant question, and that's why I was reluctant to go down the grand strategy route. As I say, all I've been doing in DC is essentially reading constant grand strategy from the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s. It's the recurrent problem. I mean, that is the issue. You know, as soon as you settle upon a grand strategy, things change anyway. I would suggest, and I don't know the American political machine very well, I would suggest it's quite useful to have subject matter experts, country experts in massive proliferation in all your offices of state. The leadership and the strategy should come from the political sphere, because that's as good as you can hope for. Now, there may be resistance against that when it comes to the machine. I know that the British Foreign Office essentially spends all of its time trying to go against whatever British Foreign Secretary, actually until the current one. I mean, that's your functional problem, but I think that's that, if you, to break it down for the sake of brevity, that's where the leadership, the strategy, and the willingness to take it on the chin and take a criticism has to come from the top. And that's why you have, that's where you have foreign affairs pieces by every would-be presidential candidate. I think that's where the place should start, with a certain flexibility within that, of course.
Well, I mean, not sure I totally agree with the spirit of your question. I mean, first off, let's not overcomplicate the problem. When I say that the Obama administration lacks a sort of a strategic orientation, I'm not saying that they need to adopt a sort of Bismarckian approach that's super Byzantine and that kind of thing, right? I just think the Obama administration appears to address issues, in a primarily ad hoc basis, and the major motivation for the administration appears to be the domestic political environment, which is not the first. I mean, there's an interesting argument that a lot of Johnson's Vietnam policy was driven by the need to protect his flank on the Great Society and so forth. And I think it probably, it reflects a not indefensible assessment of American sort of interests and preferences based on the sort of period of unipolarity. I mean, America didn't really need a strategy in the 1990s. I mean, this is the sort of Clinton approach. I think was like, well, we can kind of do everything, and we don't need to make decisions because things, will come up and we'll deal with them. Which certainly in that time period had a sort of a defensible characteristic. I mean, look, I think to the degree to which the United States has had a kind of meaningful strategy over time in the way that I'm talking about in a more sort of colloquial sense, in the sense that sort of we're pursuing a few kind of key objectives and we're willing to prioritize in the way that John, I think, is talking about. I mean, Nixon obviously was a strategic president, Eisenhower, Reagan, Bush struggled with the vision thing, but I think he was dealing, he dealt very adeptly with the problems that he faced. Bush 1, I'm talking about. But I think, a strategic orientation has to come. Not only should it come, it has to come from the political level. It's the way that our government works. I mean, Eisenhower would be the ultimate example of somebody who really pursued a particular strategy and changed the U.S. government to adhere to it. He was very concerned and had very experience in foreign affairs and defense matters, obviously. He initiated this sort of solarium exercise, which was an effort to really force his cabinet members to think it through and to adopt it. I mean, he forced his principal committee members to attend every single National Security Council session, which now they're routinely attended by deputies or below, and there's I think they have a much more bureaucratic orientation. So I think it would need to come from the very highest level by a conviction at the very highest level that and I think George W. Bush did have something more like this, a conviction that the United States needed to be prioritizing and needed to make strategic decisions, and it would need to that would need to be reflected in the appointments to senior positions, principal cabinet level, but also down to make sure that the bureaucracy adheres to the strategic goal. But I don't think that's an unreasonable request. I think in the 2016 election, for instance, we could have somebody who I mean, if Hillary Clinton was victorious, for instance, she might really want to prioritize the rebalance, which would at least reflect some degree of a strategic orientation in the terms that I'm talking about. And if she appointed Kirk Campbell to an important position, yada yada yada, and that would be the kind of thing. I mean, it might not be Dwight Eisenhower, but so in some sense, the U.S. government is designed not to allow a thoroughly strategic orientation because it's inherently leaky and there are multiple veto points and you have the division of the executive and legislative. But as the situation in the world becomes more difficult and we face more constraints, I think there's going to be more power to the argument that we should have a more strategic orientation, that we can't do the Clinton thing, which is just do everything when we want to. And so that's sort of why I have some optimism about the problem.
Let me just take it from a little bit different perspective. I think there's always been this tension, as John was alluding to, and you see it in terms of kind of being a generalist versus a specialist. And when you see the way in which the bureaucracies of state, not big State Department, but state in general, there seems to be more and more of a feeling that you can simply kind of put the specialist in their box and come to them when you need them for something. But of course, the very knowledge you get by being a specialist allows you to see things. And so as someone who has always kind of worked on one particular area, but I grew up in Japan but work on Turkey, so these kind of very strange worlds of kind of East Asia and Middle East, and I agree everything with what Bridge said earlier, which is basically, it's amazing in East Asian policy, no matter if you completely disagree with the Chinese position or Japanese, you can have an active and very cordial debate about things, and in the Middle East, it's just almost like the tone of it is just, you're a Zionist and you're this, and it gets personal very quickly, and it's almost impossible as an analyst to be in that world without picking a side, because you will be dead meat no matter which side you pick, and if you try to stay in the middle, you get run over in some sense. And so what I would simply say is, the challenge is, how do you have leaders who are strategically oriented? They can't possibly know every aspect of the world, but they know when they need to turn to people for help. And I think that's when you have some of the leaders that we've talked about who say, look, I can't possibly be an expert on everything, but I want to kind of value that. And I think even, as someone who has a PhD from this country and has gone the academic route before going into government, we see that in all aspects of jobs. It's not just the U.S. government. It's in all aspects, right? When you look at the active pages about people with PhDs and our academics being useful, why are they not being more involved in public debates? The incentives are set up wrong, right? The incentives that are there to kind of have a successful career makes it such you should never really say anything publicly. You should always be kind of behind the scenes and make sure you never have to write a foreign affairs article, right? If I have to write a foreign affairs article as a candidate, by the time I run, I'm going to get nailed for something because it's impossible to be wishy-washy all the way through. And so I think the question is, how do we kind of as constituents and also as people who are kind of plotting our own careers, both follow what we know to be true in our own kind of areas of interest? Some of us are going to be more focused on a particular area because that's the area you know best, and others are going to be more general, but you're able to appreciate the other side and you're able to work together on that. And I think the very best managers I've seen in the State Department and other areas I've worked appreciate this. Those that don't, and they're not penalized for that, I have questions about. Like, that's where you need to have political oversight. And the last thing I would say is, when you look at the types of appointments that all administrations make, but most recently, when you look at the confirmation hearings of some of our ambassadors who don't know basic facts about countries, that is very problematic, and it doesn't matter if you support the administration or not. You need to come out and say, look, that is unacceptable. We cannot send an ambassador, we can't have an assistant secretary who doesn't know these very basic qualities. And at the very least, that shows a lack of appreciation, and you weren't staff, because we don't expect that person to know everything about Norway or Argentina, but you need to be able to be on the same page, and all of us from the foreign policy community need to weigh in at a certain point.
Just one little final addendum to that is you know, from a historical perspective, the book I want to write is In Defense of Mistakes, right? Mistakes happen. That's the nature of the whole process. We're so neurotic about these things. That's the nature and the reality of great power politics historically. And by the way, Britain will tell you, the British historical line, we're the Greeks to your Romans, that sort of nonsense, is basically an old diluted version of its own history. What did Britain do in the 19th century? It was essentially a pirate nation that went around bullying a lot of other nations. So
our capital.
Yeah, exactly. 200 years ago, almost exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I just want to thank our panelists and thank you all for coming. This was really great and really useful, I think. Before you have a copy of The National Interest, John actually has an article in this current issue. You should check it out. And thanks for coming, and hopefully we'll see you all at the next event in this series. Thanks.
Great, thanks. Thanks, good to see you.
Good job, man. Good to see you.
Thank you, yeah.